Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, all the way to ancient Rome to unravel one of history's most peculiar imperial decrees. Imagine, if you will, the bustling forum, usually alive with the clamor of merchants, the impassioned cries of politicians, and the general hubbub of Roman life. But something feels off. A strange, pervasive quiet hangs in the air, a silent tension that makes the back of your neck tingle. You see faces, some stern, some simply blank, but very few smiling, and certainly no one is laughing, because tonight you're about to enter the bizarre, laughter-free zone of Emperor Elagabalus, a man so eccentric, so utterly detached from reality that he once tried to ban joy itself. You probably won't survive the awkward silence, but don't worry, we're doing it from the comfort of your bed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling up to it, drop a comment with your location and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the early 3rd century AD, specifically around the year 218. The Roman Empire, vast and powerful, is nonetheless in a period of, shall we say, fluid leadership. Emperors come and go with alarming frequency, often at the sharp end of a dagger or a poisoned cup. Into this rather volatile scene steps Varius Avitus Bassianus, better known to history as Elagabalus. He's young, barely 14 when he ascends to the purple, and he's bringing with him a whole new vibe, one that Rome was decidedly not ready for. His reign, lasting just 4 short years, is a whirlwind of religious reform, scandalous parties, and truly baffling edicts. And among these baffling edicts, one stands out with a particular uncomfortable silence: the attempted suppression of public laughter. It's not that Romans never smiled or found things amusing in private. Oh no, that would be truly dystopian, wouldn't it? Imagine trying to suppress a giggle when you accidentally trip over your toga. But Elagabalus, in his infinite, youthful wisdom, seemed to believe that public displays of excessive mirth were unbecoming, perhaps even a sign of disrespect towards his divine personage. He was, after all, attempting to establish the worship of Elagabal, a Syrian sun god, as the dominant cult in Rome, replacing the traditional pantheon. And serious gods, apparently, demanded serious faces. Historians still argue whether this ban was ever truly codified into law or if it was more of an unspoken imperial expectation, enforced by the intimidating presence of his personal guard. Either way, the message was clear: lighten up, and you might just end up in hot water, or perhaps a very cold, dark prison cell. You can almost feel the collective clenching of jaws, the careful monitoring of facial expressions as citizens navigated their daily lives under the watchful, unamused eye of their teenage emperor. It certainly makes you appreciate the simple freedom of a good, hearty chuckle, doesn't it?
As you continue to drift through the annals of Roman history, let's step back even further, beyond the grandeur of Rome itself, to understand Elagabalus's Syrian origins. Our young emperor didn't hail from the heart of the Roman aristocracy. He came from Emesa, a vibrant, sun-drenched city in the province of Syria, now modern-day Homs. His family was no ordinary lineage. They were the hereditary high priests of Elagabal, a powerful sun god worshipped there. This wasn't just a casual religious affiliation. It was a deep ancestral connection that imbued his family with immense local power and spiritual authority. Imagine growing up in a place where your family weren't just community leaders, but direct conduits to the divine, responsible for elaborate rituals and the sacred flame. This upbringing would have shaped his entire worldview, making him fundamentally different from the traditional Roman elite he was about to rule. His full name, Varius Avitus Bassianus, eventually became Marcus Aurelius Augustus, but the name that stuck, Elagabalus, was derived directly from the deity he served, a constant reminder of his priestly roots. This connection to a foreign cult was, for the Romans, already a major red flag. Roman religion was deeply intertwined with the state. It was a civic duty, a matter of tradition and order, not typically a fervent personal devotion to an exotic deity. While Rome was generally tolerant of foreign gods, integrating them into its vast pantheon, the idea of a Roman emperor, the Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of Rome, abandoning the traditional gods for a single Syrian sun god, was simply unfathomable. It was like swapping out all the traditional Christmas decorations for, well, something entirely alien to the established festive spirit. But our story isn't just about young Elagabalus. It's also about the formidable woman who pulled many of the strings behind the scenes, his grandmother, Julia Maesa. She was a member of the powerful Severan dynasty, a sister to the Empress Julia Domna, the wife of Emperor Septimius Severus. This made her a matriarch of immense influence and political cunning. While Elagabalus was caught up in his religious duties and youthful indulgences in Emesa, it was Julia Maesa who was navigating the treacherous waters of Roman imperial politics. She was a survivor, a strategist, and possessed a keen understanding of how power truly worked in Rome. She had witnessed the rise and fall of emperors, including the assassination of her own brother-in-law, Caracalla, and the subsequent chaos. Historians still argue whether Julia Maesa truly believed in her grandson's divine mandate, or if she simply saw him as a pliable tool to restore her family's prestige and power after Caracalla's death. But what's clear is that she had the political acumen to spot an opportunity and the ruthless determination to seize it. Without her, Elagabalus, the teenage priest, would likely have remained a local religious figure, never daring to dream of the imperial purple. She was the hidden force, the quiet engine behind his improbable ascent to the Roman throne, and her ambitions would profoundly shape not only his reign, but also its eventual, dramatic end. You can almost feel the weight of her ambition, a silent force pushing the young emperor onto a path he was ill-equipped to tread.
With Julia Maesa's shrewd political maneuvering, the stage was set for the rise to power of young Elagabalus, a tale as improbable as his later attempts to ban laughter. Following the assassination of Emperor Caracalla and the brief, unpopular reign of his murderer, Macrinus, a power vacuum emerged, ripe for exploitation. Julia Maesa, living in relative exile in Emesa, saw her opportunity. She began to spread rumors, carefully crafted and subtly amplified, that her grandson, Varius Avitus Bassianus, our future Elagabalus, was in fact the illegitimate son of the beloved former emperor, Caracalla. This was, to put it mildly, a bold claim, given that Caracalla was actually Julia Maesa's nephew and Elagabalus's cousin once removed. But in the chaotic atmosphere of 3rd century Roman politics, a good, juicy rumor could be as potent as a legion. The legions stationed in Syria, many of whom had been loyal to Caracalla, were receptive to this narrative. They were disillusioned with Macrinus, who was seen as an outsider, lacking the imperial charisma or the right dynastic connections. Julia Maesa played directly into their nostalgia for the Severan dynasty, reminding them of the stability and martial glory associated with Caracalla's father, Septimius Severus. She presented young Elagabalus not just as a priest of the sun god, but as a direct heir to the Severan legacy, a beacon of hope in a turbulent time. Imagine the whispers spreading through the campfires, the hushed conversations among soldiers, clinging to the idea of a legitimate heir who could restore order and perhaps even bring back the glory days. On May 16, 218 AD, just a few short weeks after the rumors began to circulate, the 12th Fulminata Legion, stationed near Emesa, formally proclaimed Elagabalus as emperor. He was barely 14 years old. This was not a unanimous decision by any means, and it sparked a brief but decisive civil war. Macrinus quickly assembled his forces, but the legions rallied behind Elagabalus, emboldened by Julia Maesa's promises and the potent symbolism of the young heir. The decisive battle took place near Antioch. Macrinus's forces were defeated, and he himself was captured and executed shortly thereafter. It was a swift, brutal, and ultimately successful coup orchestrated by a determined grandmother and executed by loyal legions. Historians still argue about the true extent of popular support for Elagabalus at this early stage, pondering whether it was genuine enthusiasm or simply a pragmatic choice by a military tired of instability. But what's clear is that a Syrian priest propelled by dynastic ambition and military might had just seized control of the mighty Roman Empire. You could almost feel the seismic shift, the tremor that ran through Rome as news of this unprecedented ascent reached the capital.
Now, with the throne secured by Julia Maes's cunning and military might, imagine the scene as Elagabalus finally made his way to Rome. His early imperial antics began even before he set foot in the Eternal City, sending shockwaves through the conservative Roman establishment. This wasn't the dignified, stoic entrance of a traditional Roman emperor. Oh no, Elagabalus arrived with a flamboyant disregard for centuries of imperial decorum, signaling immediately that Rome was in for a wild, unpredictable ride. One of his first, truly unsettling moves was to send a painted portrait of himself to Rome, to be displayed prominently in the Senate House. This wasn't just any portrait. It depicted him in his full Syrian priestly regalia, dressed in rich silk robes with an elaborate tiara holding the sacred black stone of Elagabal. For the Roman senators, who expected their emperor to be portrayed in military attire or a toga embodying Roman gravitas and republican virtue, this was an audacious affront. It was a clear declaration that he was not just an emperor, but a priest of a foreign god, and that god was now taking precedence. Imagine your new head of state sending a portrait of themselves dressed as a rock star, demanding it be hung in the most hallowed halls of government. It simply wasn't done, and it immediately alienated the powerful elite. Upon his actual arrival, Elagabalus continued to flout tradition with brazen enthusiasm. He entered the city not in the customary military procession, but with an entourage that was a mix of exotic dancers, effeminate men, and musicians, all dressed in similarly outlandish silks. He himself often wore makeup, a practice considered deeply effeminate and undignified for a Roman man, let alone an emperor. He also reportedly shaved his beard, preferring a smooth face, which further defied the Roman ideal of masculine appearance. These weren't subtle transgressions. They were loud, deliberate statements. Every choice, from his attire to his companions, seemed calculated to shock and offend the Roman senatorial class, who valued austerity, tradition, and strict gender roles. It was a full frontal assault on Roman sensibilities, delivered with the uninhibited confidence of a teenager who knew no bounds. He immediately began to replace key Roman officials with his own favorites, often men from Syria or those who participated in his lavish and scandalous lifestyle. This further marginalized the traditional Roman aristocracy, who'd long served the state. Imagine the whispers, the stunned disbelief, as venerable Roman families watched their positions in influence erode, replaced by what they considered to be uncouth foreigners and dissolute companions. Historians still argue whether these initial provocations were the calculated actions of a cunning strategist seeking to dismantle the old order, or simply the impulsive behavior of a sheltered, powerful youth with no understanding of Roman political realities. Either way, his early reign was a masterclass in alienation, setting a tumultuous stage for all the baffling edicts that would follow, including, of course, the attempted ban on laughter. You can almost feel the collective intake of breath from the Roman elite, a silent, disapproving gasp that likely set the tone for their relationship with this most peculiar emperor. As Elagabalus continued his unsettling tenure in Rome, you'd quickly realize that his imperial antics weren't just about shocking behavior. They were deeply intertwined with his most ambitious and, to the Romans, most offensive project: his imperial religious reforms. His primary goal wasn't just to be emperor, but to impose the worship of his Syrian sun god, Elagabal, as the dominant, if not sole, deity of the entire Roman Empire. This was a radical departure from Roman religious tradition, which was largely polytheistic and syncretic, meaning it readily absorbed and integrated foreign gods into its existing pantheon. But Elagabalus wasn't interested in integration. He demanded supremacy.
Imagine the sacred black stone, the cult object of Elagabal, a meteorite purportedly fallen from the heavens, being paraded through the streets of Rome with more pomp and circumstance than any traditional Roman god had ever received. Elagabalus himself, clad in his priestly robes, would lead these processions, dancing and singing hymns to his god, often to the bewilderment and quiet horror of the Roman populace. This wasn't a subtle introduction. It was a full frontal assault on the spiritual heart of Rome. He even went so far as to attempt to marry his god, Elagabal, to various Roman goddesses, including Minerva and even the revered Vesta, the goddess of the hearth. These were deeply sacred figures in Roman religion, and to suggest such unions with a foreign deity was considered utterly blasphemous, an act of profound disrespect to their heritage. It's like trying to force a brand new exotic flavor of ice cream onto an entire country that's perfectly happy with vanilla, and insisting it's now the only flavor allowed. He stripped the traditional Roman gods of their prominence, demoting Jupiter Capitolinus, the king of the gods, from his prime position. This wasn't just a theological shift, it was a political statement, undermining the very foundations of Roman identity and state religion. Temples to other gods were neglected and their priests marginalized, while vast sums were poured into the new cult of Elagabal. This religious fanaticism, combined with his general disregard for Roman customs, was deeply destabilizing. The Romans weren't inherently intolerant of new gods, but they expected them to fit within the established order, not overthrow it. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus genuinely believed in his divine mission, or if his religious fervor was merely a means to consolidate personal power and further defy the Roman establishment. What's clear is that his relentless promotion of Elagabal at the expense of deeply held Roman beliefs brewed a cauldron of resentment that would eventually boil over. You could almost feel the spiritual unease, the quiet questioning of what this new, strange emperor meant for the very soul of Rome.
The pinnacle of Elagabalus's religious zeal, and perhaps the most tangible manifestation of his new vibe, was the construction and dedication of the sun god's temple on the Palatine Hill. This wasn't just a modest shrine. It was designed to be the grandest religious edifice in Rome, overshadowing even the venerable temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. Imagine the architectural audacity, a massive, opulent structure rising above the city, specifically built to house the sacred black stone of Elagabal. This stone, believed to be a meteorite, was the focal point of his cult, and Elagabalus ensured it received the most extravagant reverence. It was regularly paraded through the city on a chariot drawn by white horses, with the emperor himself running backward in front of it, guiding the horses amidst clouds of incense and the chanting of Syrian hymns. It was a spectacle designed to awe, but to many Romans it was simply bewildering. The ceremonies held within this new temple were equally outlandish, a stark contrast to the staid, traditional Roman rituals. Elagabalus would preside over these rites, often dressed in sumptuous, multicolored silk robes adorned with a tiara and other exotic priestly accoutrements. Sacrifices were made not of traditional Roman animals, but of camels and oxen, and sometimes, reportedly, even human sacrifices, though historians still argue vehemently about the veracity of these more gruesome claims. The air would be thick with the scent of foreign frankincense and myrrh, and the sounds were of strange Eastern music and dancing, all a far cry from the orderly, solemn prayers and animal divinations that characterized Roman religious practice. It was a sensory overload for a Roman citizen accustomed to a more grounded, less flamboyant spirituality. This lavish temple and its alien rituals served a dual purpose for Elagabalus. On one hand, it was a genuine expression of his deep devotion to his ancestral god. On the other, it was a powerful political statement. By placing his god at the apex of the Roman pantheon and making himself its supreme priest, he was asserting his absolute authority, both divine and temporal, over Rome. It was a way of saying, my power comes not just from the legions, but from a higher, more potent deity than your traditional gods. The very act of building such a prominent temple and forcing its rites upon a reluctant populace was a profound act of defiance against the Roman establishment.
Historians still debate whether his religious reforms were a genuine attempt at syncretism, aiming to blend Eastern and Western faiths, or simply a megalomaniacal effort to impose his personal cult. But for the average Roman, witnessing these daily parades and the construction of this alien temple, it was likely just another unsettling sign that their teenage emperor was truly, irrevocably off his rocker. You can almost smell the exotic incense mixing with the familiar scent of Roman streets, an unsettling blend of the sacred and the bizarre.
As you witness these daily parades and the construction of the exotic temple, you start to grasp the depth of Roman reactions to Elagabalus. It wasn't just quiet disapproval. It was a potent mix of bewilderment, disgust, and simmering resentment, particularly among the traditional Roman elite. Imagine being a venerable senator, steeped in centuries of Roman gravitas and republican ideals, watching your emperor prance around in silk robes, dancing to foreign music, and elevating a meteorite over Jupiter himself. It was a complete inversion of everything they held sacred, a profound insult to their cultural identity. They saw him not just as eccentric, but as a dangerous force undermining the very fabric of Roman society. The Roman aristocracy, the nobles, prided themselves on their austerity, their military prowess, and their adherence to traditional virtues. They valued gravitas, dignity, virtus, manliness or courage, and pietas, piety, duty to gods, family, and state. Elagabalus, in their eyes, embodied the exact opposite of these ideals. His effeminate clothing, his reported sexual escapades, his blatant disregard for the ancestral gods, all of it was anathema to their worldview. He was not just an emperor, he was a living embodiment of everything they considered decadent and foreign. The whispers among them would have been sharp, venomous, questioning his legitimacy and his sanity. It was like seeing your respected, traditional head of state suddenly swap places with a performance artist from a completely different culture and then watching them completely upend all the established rules. The shock would have been immense. For the ordinary Roman citizen, the reaction might have been more varied. Some would have undoubtedly been captivated by the exotic spectacles, drawn by the novelty of the new god and the lavish parades. Others, however, would have been deeply disturbed. Religious traditions were deeply ingrained in daily life, tied to agricultural cycles, family rituals, and civic duties. To see these traditions openly scorned and replaced by a foreign cult would have caused genuine spiritual unease. And then there was the sheer economic impact. The vast sums spent on Elagabalus's personal indulgences and his new temple would have drained the imperial coffers, potentially leading to increased taxes or neglect of public works, which would affect everyone. Historians still argue whether the Roman populace was genuinely offended by his religious reforms or more concerned about the political instability and economic drain. What's clear is that Elagabalus managed to alienate almost every segment of Roman society, from the powerful Senate and the influential Praetorian Guard to many ordinary citizens. This widespread discontent brewed quietly, like a slow-burning fuse, ready to ignite. His every action, from his religious zeal to his strange personal life, became another point of friction, pushing Rome closer to a breaking point. You can almost feel the tension in the air, a silent, disapproving hum that followed the emperor wherever he went, a stark contrast to the lively bustle Rome usually enjoyed.
Beyond the grand pronouncements and religious upheavals, a significant source of Roman discomfort with Elagabalus stemmed from his deeply unconventional emperor's personal life. His actions in this sphere were not just deviations from the norm, they were outright challenges to Roman concepts of masculinity, family, and public decency. He was, to put it mildly, a trailblazer in upsetting societal expectations. One of the most scandalous aspects of his private life, which quickly became public fodder, was his series of marriages. While Roman emperors often had multiple wives for dynastic or political reasons, Elagabalus took it to an entirely new level, often with shocking disregard for religious and social taboos. He famously married Aquilia Severa, a Vestal virgin, a woman who had taken a sacred vow of chastity to the goddess Vesta. This was an act considered sacrilegious and punishable by death for both parties. He claimed the marriage was necessary to unite the Roman goddess Vesta with his Syrian god Elagabal, a divine marriage to parallel his earthly one. Imagine the collective gasp of horror from the Roman populace. It was like a modern leader marrying a revered religious figure and claiming it was for a cosmic union. It was simply unthinkable, a direct assault on the very foundations of Roman religious and social order. But his marriages weren't confined to women. Perhaps even more shocking to the Roman elite were his public relationships with men. He openly referred to one of his male lovers, an athlete named Hierocles, as his husband, and was even said to have presented himself as Hierocles' wife. He reportedly promised vast sums of money to any physician who could perform a sex change operation on him, further blurring the rigid gender lines so deeply ingrained in Roman society. These actions were not just unusual, they were perceived as deeply effeminate and shameful, undermining the very idea of a Roman emperor as the embodiment of masculine strength and virtue. Roman society, while it had its own complexities regarding same-sex relations, certainly did not condone an emperor adopting a passive or feminine role, especially not in such an overt and public manner. These personal choices, broadcast to the public by a combination of rumor and his own brazen displays, were seen as further evidence of his unfitness to rule. They painted a picture of an emperor who was not just eccentric, but morally corrupt and dangerously unstable. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus genuinely identified with a non-binary gender, or whether these actions were a deliberate form of anti-Roman performance art designed to provoke and dismantle traditional norms. Either way, his personal life became a potent symbol of everything that was perceived to be wrong with his reign, contributing significantly to the growing discontent among the military and the political elite. You can almost feel the uncomfortable silence in Roman drawing rooms as news of his latest marital scandal would spread, each revelation fueling the quiet anger.
Beyond his scandalous marriages and fluid gender expression, Elagabalus further cemented his reputation for defying Roman norms through his extraordinary choices in wardrobe and appearance. You see, Roman masculinity, particularly for a public figure, was deeply tied to a certain aesthetic, simplicity, sobriety, and a rejection of overt ornamentation. Emperors were typically depicted in military attire, a plain toga, or perhaps the dignified philosophical cloak. Elagabalus, however, seemed determined to dress as if he were starring in a perpetually avant-garde fashion show, much to the dismay of the traditional Roman eye. His most striking deviation was his penchant for silk robes. While silk was known in Rome, it was considered a luxury, often imported from the Far East via the Silk Road, and usually worn by women or in very subtle accents by men. For an emperor to parade around in full silk gowns, dyed in vibrant, almost unheard-of colors for male attire, think deep purples, fiery oranges, and shimmering golds, was seen as utterly effeminate and undignified. He reportedly adorned himself with gold and jewels, even wearing a tiara, a headpiece associated with Eastern monarchs and priests, not Roman emperors. Imagine the gasps as he appeared, looking less like a military commander and more like a high priest from a foreign land, draped in shimmering fabrics that whispered of opulence and alien customs. It was as if he deliberately tried to erase all visual cues of Roman masculinity from his imperial persona. Adding to the visual shock was his use of makeup. Roman men, especially those of high status, did not wear makeup. It was considered the domain of women or actors. Elagabalus, however, reportedly painted his eyes, rouged his cheeks, and used depilatories to achieve a smooth, hairless complexion, a stark contrast to the Roman ideal of the bearded, rugged man. He even styled his hair in elaborate, often towering arrangements, sometimes adorned with gold dust. These choices weren't merely personal preferences, they were public statements, challenging the very bedrock of Roman social and gender expectations. It's like a modern head of state showing up to a formal summit dressed as a fantastical creature from a video game. It simply wouldn't compute for the established order. These aesthetic choices were not isolated incidents. They were part of a consistent pattern of behavior that screamed, "I am not like you, and I do not care for your traditions." Every silken swish of his robes, every painted line on his face was a subtle but profound act of defiance against the very people he ruled. Historians still argue whether his flamboyant appearance was a genuine expression of his personal identity or a calculated, almost performance art-like attempt to shock and dismantle the rigid social codes of Rome. Either way, his fashion choices were a constant, visual reminder of his perceived foreignness and his unsettling disregard for Roman gravitas, further alienating him from the Senate and the military, and ultimately contributing to the atmosphere that made a bizarre decree like the laughter ban seem just another day in Elagabalus's Rome. You could almost feel the collective stiffening of Roman necks as he would pass by, each thread of his silk robes a silent provocation.
Against this backdrop of religious innovation, social transgression, and sartorial rebellion, the ground was fertile for the truly bizarre. The imperial ban announced. While the exact phrasing of Elagabalus's decree against laughter isn't preserved in a single surviving stone tablet, the historical accounts from ancient writers like Cassius Dio suggest it was part of his broader effort to impose a solemn, almost religiously austere atmosphere upon Rome, especially within public spaces and in the presence of the emperor himself. It wasn't necessarily a decree carved in stone and posted in the forum, but rather an imperial expectation, a strongly implied command disseminated through his pronouncements and the actions of his loyal, if sometimes bewildered, retinue. The rationale, from his perspective, was likely tied to his deep devotion to Elagabal, a god as serious and all-encompassing as the sun deity, in his view, demanded an equally serious and reverent populace. Laughter, in this rigid framework, was seen as undignified, frivolous, and perhaps even a form of disrespect towards the divine majesty he embodied. Imagine being a Roman citizen, going about your day, and gradually sensing a shift in the air. The usual casual banter in the marketplace dwindles. The raucous jokes among soldiers become hushed. The spontaneous guffaws from a group of friends watching a street performer turn into polite, strained smiles. The message would have filtered down through various channels, from the imperial court, through the Praetorian Guard, to local officials. It was a subtle, pervasive change, more a chilling of the atmosphere than a sudden explicit prohibition with clearly defined penalties. You wouldn't see no laughing signs plastered on walls, but you would certainly feel the palpable tension, the constant self-monitoring that became second nature. It's like being in a very strict, old-fashioned library where even a cough feels too loud.
So, with this bizarre decree hanging in the air, you might be asking yourself, how on earth did the Romans actually manage the enforcement mechanisms of a ban on laughter? It's not like they had laughter police with decibel meters, right? The truth is, the enforcement was likely inconsistent, pervasive, and heavily reliant on the pervasive atmosphere of fear and the ever-present threat of informers. This wasn't a publicly codified law with clear punishments for every suppressed giggle. It was more of an unspoken imperial expectation, a constant pressure to conform to the emperor's desired solemnity. Imagine the subtlety. You wouldn't be arrested for a single chuckle. Instead, the pressure would come from the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal soldiers, whose presence was a constant reminder of imperial authority. Their stern, unsmiling faces would serve as a chilling deterrent. A guard might simply glare at someone whose mouth twitched in an unapproved smile, or offer a pointed cough that would send shivers down a Roman spine. The penalty for open mirth might not be immediate imprisonment, but perhaps a public rebuke, a confiscation of property, or even an invitation to a private audience with the emperor, which few would willingly accept. It's a bit like being in a very strict classroom where the teacher has eyes in the back of their head. You learn to monitor yourself even when no one is directly looking. Beyond the official presence, the ban also relied on informers. In any autocratic regime, there are always those eager to gain favor with the ruling power. These individuals, often called delatores in Rome, would report on any perceived transgression, hoping for reward or recognition. So your neighbor, that seemingly friendly merchant, or even a disgruntled family member could potentially report you for an inappropriate burst of joy. This created a climate of suspicion, making private expressions of humor a risky venture even within one's own home. Who could you trust to genuinely share a laugh with without fear of reprisal? This constant self-monitoring, this internal censor, would have been the most potent enforcement tool of all. The effectiveness of the ban would have varied greatly. In the immediate vicinity of the imperial palace or during official ceremonies, the solemnity would have been almost absolute. Here, even a polite smile might have been suppressed. But further out in the sprawling city, in the taverns and back alleys, the enforcement would have been harder to maintain, with more subtle forms of humor likely flourishing. Historians still argue whether the ban was genuinely widespread or largely confined to the elite circles of Rome. But what's undeniable is that the mere threat of it, the pervasive understanding that public joy was frowned upon, would have cast a long, unamused shadow over the daily lives of Roman citizens. It makes you realize how precious the simple freedom to laugh truly is, doesn't it? A freedom that, for a few short years, was severely curtailed by one very peculiar emperor.
Now, imagine navigating the streets of Rome under this peculiar decree. Public life, under the ban, wouldn't have been a dramatic, silent movie, but rather a subtly altered reality. A city where the vibrant hum of human interaction was dampened, carefully controlled. The usual soundscape of Rome was characterized by lively chatter, the shouts of vendors, the passionate rhetoric of politicians, and yes, the ubiquitous bursts of laughter. Under Elagabalus, this joyful noise was, if not entirely extinguished, certainly muffled. Picture the bustling Roman Forum, a place designed for public assembly, debate, and social mingling. Normally, you'd hear the boisterous laughter of a group of citizens debating the latest gladiatorial match, or the snorts of amusement from a senator listening to a particularly scathing political lampoon. But now, as you walk through, you'd observe a different scene. Merchants might still call out their wares, but their tone would be more muted, their interactions less playful. You'd see citizens engaging in conversation, but their faces would be carefully composed, their smiles restrained, their chuckles swallowed before they could escape. It's like being in a very formal reception where everyone is trying to make a good impression. The energy is there, but it's tightly contained, lacking spontaneity. The impact wouldn't have been just on loud, boisterous laughter. Even small, involuntary expressions of amusement would have become a source of anxiety. Imagine attending a public theatrical performance where comedies were traditionally performed. The actors might still deliver witty lines, but the audience's reaction would be a stifled cough, a polite, almost imperceptible nod, or a silent shaking shoulder as they tried to suppress a giggle. The shared communal joy that makes live entertainment so special would be fundamentally altered, replaced by a tense, self-conscious experience. You'd find yourself constantly monitoring your own facial muscles, fearing that an errant twitch might draw unwanted attention from an unamused Praetorian guard. This pervasive atmosphere would have subtly affected daily routines. Visiting the baths, a Roman social hub, might feel less relaxing as casual conversations were more guarded. Dining in public taverns, usually lively places, might involve hushed tones and watchful glances. The spontaneity that enriches human interaction would be chipped away at, leaving a lingering sense of unease. Historians still argue about how deeply this ban affected the mental well-being of the Roman populace, pondering whether it contributed to increased stress or a general sense of despondency. But for those living through it, the simple act of navigating public spaces became an exercise in emotional self-control, turning something as natural as a shared laugh into a peculiar, almost rebellious act. It certainly makes you appreciate the casual, uninhibited chatter and laughter you hear every day, doesn't it?
Given the pervasive atmosphere of watchful eyes and suppressed smiles in public, you can imagine that Roman citizens, being human, found ways to reclaim their joy. This led to a flourishing of private acts of humor. shared within the safety of trusted circles. A quiet rebellion against the emperor's bizarre decree. The home, especially among close family and intimate friends, became a sanctuary where genuine laughter could still echo, albeit perhaps a little more cautiously at first. Imagine a Roman family gathered in their triclinium for dinner. The door is closed, perhaps a servant known for loyalty is present, or perhaps no servants at all. Here, away from the prying eyes of informers and the stern gaze of the Praetorian Guard, the true Roman spirit could emerge. A witty remark about the emperor's latest absurd decree, a humorous anecdote about a clumsy neighbor, or a sarcastic quip about the price of imported spices might elicit a knowing glance, a shared smirk, and then a burst of silent, shaking laughter. You can almost picture them, hands clamped over mouths, shoulders trembling, tears silently streaming down their faces as they fought to contain their mirth. It was a physical release, a cathartic experience made all the more potent by its clandestine nature. These private gatherings became essential for maintaining sanity and connection. It was where Romans could truly vent their frustrations, share their bewilderment, and find solidarity in shared amusement. The humor might have become more nuanced, more reliant on subtle cues and inside jokes, but it was humor nonetheless. Think of it as a form of ancient Roman dark humor, finding levity in the very absurdity of their situation. A satirical poem might be recited quietly among friends, its biting wit appreciated not with applause, but with silent, knowing nods. A caricature of Elagabalus, perhaps crudely drawn on a wax tablet, might be passed around, eliciting silent convulsions of laughter. This shift to private humor also highlights the deep importance of trust in Roman society under Elagabalus. To share a true, uninhibited laugh meant to expose oneself, to be vulnerable, and that vulnerability could be dangerous if betrayed. So the circles of trust likely tightened, reinforcing bonds among those who dared to share a joke. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of such enforced emotional suppression on individuals, pondering whether it led to increased anxiety or a heightened appreciation for genuine connection. But for those living through it, the quiet hum of suppressed laughter in a friend's home must have been a powerful, defiant sound, a testament to the human need for joy that even an emperor could not truly extinguish. You can almost feel the relief, the warmth of shared humor in a world where it had become a precious, forbidden fruit.
To truly appreciate the audacity of Elagabalus's laughter band, you need to understand the rich, nuanced tapestry of the Roman sense of humor that existed before he came along and tried to put a damper on things. It wasn't a monolithic entity, but it certainly had distinct characteristics that set it apart from, say, modern slapstick. Romans, particularly the educated elite, often favored wit, satire, and clever wordplay. Think less pie in the face and more a rap battle fought with elegant Latin phrases. Roman comedies, like those penned by playwrights such as Plautus and Terence, often revolved around intricate plots, mistaken identities, cunning servants outsmarting their foolish masters, and the timeless tribulations of love and family. These plays weren't necessarily designed for belly laughs, but for intelligent chuckles and appreciative smiles at the cleverness of the dialogue and the absurdity of the situations. A good Roman joke, especially among intellectuals, might involve a sophisticated pun in Latin, a subtle dig at a political rival delivered with a perfectly straight face, or a wry anecdote that highlighted someone's folly. The humor was often intellectual, intended to showcase the speaker's sharpness and erudition. It was like a very sophisticated, ancient version of a stand-up routine that required a deep understanding of Roman society and language to truly get the punchline. However, it wasn't all highbrow. Romans also enjoyed more visceral forms of entertainment that undoubtedly elicited genuine, uninhibited laughter. Think of the crowds at the gladiatorial games or chariot races. While the primary emotions might have been excitement and anticipation, surely there were moments of pure, unadulterated amusement at a particularly clumsy fighter, an unexpected turn of events, or a horse tripping over its own hooves. These were public spectacles where the collective roar of the crowd would have included plenty of spontaneous laughter. And of course, in the privacy of their homes, among family and trusted friends, Romans would have indulged in all forms of humor, from silly jokes to good-natured teasing, much like people do today. Satirical poets like Horace and Juvenal, though writing a bit before Elagabalus, perfectly captured the Roman knack for wryly observing the absurdities and hypocrisies of their society, often with a biting, world-weary humor that still resonates. So while public decorum often dictated a more restrained demeanor, particularly for the upper classes, Romans were far from a humorless people. Their laughter might have been more often a private affair, shared with trusted companions over a glass of wine or at a convivial banquet, but it was vibrant and present nonetheless. The laughter ban, then, wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a profound assault on a fundamental aspect of their social interaction and emotional release. It forced humor underground, transforming what was often a lighthearted connection into a clandestine act. Historians still argue whether the Roman concept of dignitas, or dignity, truly suppressed public displays of emotion, or if it was more about how those emotions were displayed and for what purpose. But what's clear is that Elagabalus's decree created an environment where even a simple, innocent laugh could be misinterpreted, scrutinized, and potentially punished. It truly makes you appreciate the simple freedom to laugh out loud, doesn't it? That beautiful, uninhibited sound.
As you continue to relax into the quiet hum of your surroundings, let's delve deeper into a fundamental aspect of human connection that Elagabalus so carelessly tried to suppress: laughter's social function. It's far more than just a pleasant sound, it's a deeply ingrained human behavior, a powerful tool for connection, communication, and even survival. When you share a laugh with someone, you're not merely acknowledging a joke, you're signaling shared understanding, empathy, and a bond that strengthens relationships. It's a collective release, a way of navigating the absurdities and stresses of life together. Think about it. A shared chuckle can diffuse tension, bridge divides, and even foster a sense of solidarity among strangers. In a group, laughter creates a powerful sense of belonging, an invisible thread weaving individuals into a cohesive, often more resilient unit. It's a rapid-fire communication that transcends language barriers, a primal expression that says, "I see what you see, and I find it amusing too." Anthropologists and psychologists have long studied laughter, noting its universal presence across cultures and its profound evolutionary significance. It's thought to have roots in our primate ancestors' playful interactions, serving as a signal of non-aggression and social acceptance, a way to show that a situation is safe and enjoyable. When you hear someone laugh, particularly a genuine, unforced laugh, it's often wonderfully contagious, triggering a similar response in you. This social contagion of laughter is what makes it so vital in group settings, creating a ripple effect of shared positive emotion. Without this easy flow of mirth, social interactions become stilted, more formal, and less authentic. The natural rhythms of conversation are disrupted as people carefully choose their words and expressions, constantly self-editing, lest they betray an inappropriate flicker of amusement. It's like trying to have a lively conversation through a pane of thick glass. You can see them, you can hear them, but something essential is missing from the connection, that spontaneous, shared energy. In ancient Rome, a society built on intricate social hierarchies, public performance, and a strong sense of civic duty, the absence of spontaneous laughter would have been profoundly impactful. Imagine the Senate, usually a place of rhetorical battles and occasional witty exchanges, suddenly devoid of even a polite chuckle. The inherent gravitas becomes oppressive, the solemnity suffocating. Even a public feast, meant to celebrate and foster camaraderie, would have felt flat, muted by the pervasive anxiety of an unspoken rule. The joy of simple human connection, the cathartic release of shared amusement, would have been replaced by a quiet vigilance, a constant self-policing of one's own face and voice. Historians still argue about the true societal cost of such emotional suppression, pondering whether it leads to increased stress, depression, or a general erosion of community bonds.
But for you, observing this humorless Rome, the pervasive silence speaks volumes, a stark reminder of how deeply we rely on laughter to navigate our shared human experience, to build bridges, and to simply feel connected. It really does make you want to let out a big, uninhibited belly laugh, doesn't it? Just to break that imaginary tension.
As you ponder the profound social role of laughter, remember that Elagabalus's eccentricities weren't limited to his spiritual quest and his attempts to silence joy. His short reign was a true cascade of other strange imperial edicts, each demonstrating a peculiar detachment from Roman reality and a penchant for the utterly bizarre. These weren't just personal quirks. Many were actual commands that disrupted the lives of ordinary citizens and further alienated the Roman elite. For instance, he was infamous for his lavish and often dangerous dinner parties. One oft-repeated, though perhaps exaggerated, tale describes how he would surprise guests by flooding dining rooms with vast quantities of roses from overhead nets, sometimes to the point of suffocating unfortunate attendees. Imagine trying to enjoy a meal while constantly fearing a fragrant, rosy avalanche. Another strange habit involved his lotteries at banquets. Guests would draw tickets, but instead of pleasant prizes, they might win anything from a live scorpion or a dead dog to incredibly rare jewels or exotic slaves. This bizarre mixture of extreme luxury and unsettling cruelty was a hallmark of his unpredictable nature. It was like going to a party where every party favor was either a treasure or a terrifying prank. Beyond parties, his administrative decisions were equally perplexing. He reportedly appointed his favorite charioteers, actors, and even prostitutes to important government positions, bypassing experienced senators and seasoned administrators. Imagine the outrage among the old Roman families, who had dedicated generations to public service, only to see crucial roles filled by individuals chosen for their entertainment value or personal favor. This blatant disregard for meritocracy and tradition further destabilized the empire and fostered widespread contempt among the established elite. He also engaged in public spectacles that blurred the lines between religious devotion and grotesque performance. He would lead processions not just with his black stone, but sometimes with wild animals, reportedly including lions and leopards pulling his chariot. These animals, supposedly tamed, would cause a stir and occasionally panic among the onlookers. This was all part of his theatrical approach to emperorship, a continuous performance art piece designed to shock and awe. Historians still argue whether these peculiar edicts and actions were signs of genuine mental instability, a deliberate strategy to break Roman society, or simply the unchecked indulgences of a sheltered teenager with absolute power and no concept of consequence. Whatever the motivation, his reign was a dizzying succession of oddities that left Rome reeling, with the laughter ban being just one, albeit prominent, thread in this tapestry of imperial strangeness. You can almost feel the collective confusion and exasperation that must have pervaded Roman society during these 4 bizarre years.
Amidst Elagabalus's escalating eccentricities and the growing disquiet of the Roman populace, a crucial player was silently reaching its breaking point: the Praetorian Guard. These weren't just any soldiers. They were the elite imperial bodyguard, stationed in Rome, tasked with protecting the emperor, but also, crucially, with maintaining order in the capital. They were a powerful, often king-making and unmaking force in Roman politics. While they were meant to be loyal to the emperor, their loyalty was often pragmatic, tied to their own welfare and the stability of the empire. When an emperor became too erratic, too unpopular, or too dangerous to the established order, the Guard often took matters into their own hands. You see, the Praetorians were a very Roman institution. They valued military discipline, traditional Roman virtues, and a certain level of decorum from their commander-in-chief. Elagabalus, with his silk robes, his foreign god, his gender-bending antics, and his increasingly erratic decrees, were a direct affront to everything they stood for. They were soldiers, men of action and tradition, not participants in a bizarre imperial circus. Imagine being a tough, seasoned veteran trained for combat and having to stand guard while your teenage emperor parades around in makeup and dresses, leading a chariot pulled by wild animals. It would have been utterly demoralizing and deeply humiliating. Their respect, and by extension, their loyalty, rapidly evaporated. Moreover, Elagabalus's constant undermining of the Senate and his favoritism towards his Syrian cronies also meant that the traditional power structures that the Praetorians understood and relied upon were crumbling. The political landscape became unpredictable, making their own positions and influence less secure. They likely saw Elagabalus as a liability, a threat to the very stability of the empire that they were sworn to protect. This growing discontent within the Praetorian Guard was the real ticking time bomb of Elagabalus's reign. While the public might suppress their laughter, the military had swords and a history of using them against unpopular rulers. This growing resentment also presented a powerful opportunity for those who sought to unseat Elagabalus. His shrewd grandmother, Julia Maesa, was keenly aware of the Praetorians' power and their mounting frustration. She understood that if her grandson was to be removed, it would be through their hands. Historians still argue whether the Guard acted purely out of patriotic duty or if they were skillfully manipulated by Julia Maesa to serve her dynastic ambitions. But what's undeniable is that they were deeply disgruntled force, waiting for the right moment to strike. You can almost feel the simmering tension in their barracks, the quiet conversations among the soldiers, as they watched their emperor unravel and decided that enough was finally enough. This wasn't just about a laughter ban. It was about the very future of Rome, and the Praetorians were about to cast their vote.
As the Praetorian Guard's patience thinned, the true architect of Elagabalus's downfall, his grandmother, Julia Maesa's intervention, became increasingly apparent. You see, Julia Maesa was a woman of immense political acumen and steely resolve. She had brought Elagabalus to power, seeing him as a means to restore her family's influence after the chaos that followed Caracalla's death. But she quickly realized that her grandson, with his bizarre antics and complete disregard for Roman traditions, was not only an embarrassment, but a severe threat to the stability of the Severan dynasty she was so determined to uphold. He was burning bridges faster than she could build them, and his continued reign threatened to bring down the entire family. Maesa was a master manipulator, understanding the intricate power dynamics of Rome far better than her impulsive grandson. She recognized the growing discontent among the Praetorian Guard and the Senate. She knew that simply advising Elagabalus was futile. He was too entrenched in his own peculiar world. Her solution was both cunning and ruthless. She began to groom an alternative. This alternative was her other grandson, Elagabalus's cousin, Severus Alexander. Alexander was a stark contrast to Elagabalus. He was younger, more serious, and crucially, he was willing to conform to traditional Roman expectations. Julia Maesa positioned him as a more acceptable, more Roman heir, carefully cultivating his image as a virtuous and promising young man. She persuaded Elagabalus to adopt Alexander as his son and heir, ostensibly to ensure the succession. Elagabalus, perhaps momentarily swayed by his grandmother's influence or simply too distracted by his own indulgences, agreed. This was a critical misstep for him, as it provided a legitimate alternative around whom all the disgruntled elements of Roman society could rally. Julia Maesa then meticulously worked to increase Alexander's popularity, ensuring he appeared in public in traditional Roman attire, engaged in appropriate Roman activities, and cultivated a serious, dignified demeanor. It was a stark visual and behavioral contrast to Elagabalus's flamboyant displays, and it didn't go unnoticed. Historians still argue about the precise timeline and extent of Julia Maesa's machinations, pondering how much was overt manipulation and how much was simply capitalizing on an emperor's self-destructive behavior. But what's clear is that her ambition and foresight were the driving forces behind the shift in power. She understood that in the volatile world of Roman politics, the best way to control an emperor was often to replace him.
You can almost feel the tension building within the imperial palace, the quiet, strategic moves of a formidable matriarch as she slowly but surely tightened the net around her unwitting grandson. The laughter ban, among all of Elagabalus's other bizarre choices, simply made Julia Mace's job all the easier.
With Julia Mesa tirelessly working behind the scenes, you witnessed the calculated strategy to ensure the rise of Severus Alexander. He was Elagabalus's first cousin, a stark contrast to the flamboyant emperor. Where Elagabalus was wild and unpredictable, Alexander was presented as calm and disciplined. Where Elagabalus embraced foreign customs, Alexander was diligently groomed to embody traditional Roman virtues. Julia Mace's plan was meticulously executed. She persuaded Elagabalus to adopt Alexander as his Caesar, the heir apparent, in 221 AD, a move that publicly designated him as the successor and provided a legitimate focus for the hopes of the disgruntled Roman establishment. Imagine the relief, almost audible, among the Senate and the Praetorian Guard when this adoption was announced. Here was a young man, only 13 at the time, who showed promise. He was trained in Roman military exercises, tutored in classical literature, and encouraged to dress and behave in a manner fitting a Roman prince. Julia Mesa made sure he was frequently seen in public, always accompanied by serious, respected Roman figures, never by the questionable companions that flocked around Elagabalus. She carefully curated his image, ensuring every appearance reinforced his suitability for the imperial throne. It was a masterclass in political public relations designed to highlight Alexander's gravitas against Elagabalus's perceived frivolity. The contrast between the two cousins became glaringly obvious. While Elagabalus was busy with his bizarre religious ceremonies and scandalous parties, Alexander was diligently performing his duties, visiting temples, and engaging with the public in a dignified manner. This deliberate juxtaposition further fueled the discontent with Elagabalus and solidified support for Alexander. People began to openly compare the two, and the comparison was never favorable to the reigning emperor. Alexander became a symbol of hope for a return to stability and traditional Roman values, a quiet promise of an end to the chaos and embarrassment that had gripped Rome. You can almost feel the whispers of hope surrounding young Alexander, a stark contrast to the quiet despair that followed Elagabalus.
As Severus Alexander's star rose, you feel the tension in the imperial palace shift, becoming almost unbearable. Elagabalus, always paranoid and possessive of his absolute power, quickly recognized the threat posed by his increasingly popular cousin. This realization led to Elagabalus's paranoia spiraling into desperate attempts to eliminate Severus Alexander, setting the stage for his own violent downfall. He had willingly adopted Alexander, perhaps under his grandmother's subtle coercion or out of a momentary lapse of judgment, but he soon regretted it bitterly as he saw the legions and the Senate flocking to his cousin. His initial attempts were subtle, testing the waters. He tried to remove Alexander from his position as Caesar, claiming he was ill or unworthy. He spread rumors about Alexander's health or loyalty, attempting to undermine the boy's growing reputation. However, Julia Maesa, ever vigilant, countered each of his moves. She rallied support for Alexander, ensuring that the Praetorian Guard and influential senators continued to view him favorably. It was a silent, dangerous chess match being played out within the walls of the palace, with the lives of two young emperors hanging in the balance. As his subtle machinations failed, Elagabalus grew more desperate and erratic. He reportedly tried to have Alexander assassinated, but the Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty had by now firmly shifted to the younger cousin, refused to carry out the order. Imagine the emperor giving a direct command to his most elite soldiers, only to be met with a cold, unyielding refusal. This blatant defiance would have confirmed his worst fears. He was losing control, and the very men sworn to protect him were now protecting his rival. This moment must have been terrifying for Elagabalus, realizing his absolute power was no longer absolute, and his life was in jeopardy. His paranoia reached a fever pitch. He would surround himself with even more sycophants and spies, trusting no one. The atmosphere in the imperial court became suffocating, filled with suspicion and fear. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's extreme actions were purely a result of his fear for his life, or if they were also rooted in a deeper psychological instability that had been present since his ascension. Whatever the underlying cause, his attempts to eliminate Alexander only served to solidify the Praetorian Guard's resolve to remove him. Each failed assassination plot, each desperate attempt to regain control, only pushed him further down the path to ruin. You can almost feel the walls closing in on Elagabalus, his strange, laughter-banning reign, now truly teetering on the brink of a very violent end. The final act was just moments away.
The stage was set, the tension unbearable, and as you watch, the inevitable finally unfolds, the final confrontation. It happened in March of 222 AD. Elagabalus, increasingly paranoid and desperate, had made a grave error in judgment. He tried to force the Praetorian Guard to remove Severus Alexander from his designated position as Caesar, essentially demanding they assassinate his cousin. This was the last straw. The Guard, whose loyalty had entirely shifted to Alexander, refused outright. Not only did they refuse, but they also demanded to see Alexander in their camp, clearly signaling their true allegiance. Elagabalus, in a desperate attempt to assert control and perhaps believing he could still sway them, foolishly went to the Praetorian camp, bringing Alexander with him. This proved to be his fatal mistake. Once inside, the Guard, fed up with his erratic behavior, his foreign ways, and his repeated attempts to undermine their chosen heir, turned on him. This wasn't a subtle plot, it was a furious public revolt. The soldiers, no longer restrained by fear or loyalty, dragged Elagabalus from his litter. The screams of his mother, Julia Somaeus, who was with him and tried to protect him, were ignored. She too was seized. What followed was a brutal and swift end. Elagabalus, barely 18 years old, and his mother were both brutally murdered by the Praetorian Guard. Their bodies were reportedly subjected to the ultimate indignity, dragged through the streets of Rome, a public display of contempt and hatred, before being thrown into the Tiber River. This gruesome act served as a stark warning to any future emperors who might dare to defy the Guard or alienate the Roman establishment. It was a clear message that their patience had limits and their power was absolute when pushed. The very river that flowed through the heart of Rome, that had seen countless triumphs, now carried away the ignominious remains of an emperor who had tried to silence laughter. Historians still argue about the precise details of his death, but the general consensus is that it was a spontaneous outburst of violence by a military frustrated beyond measure. It marked the definitive end of the chaos and scandal that had defined his 4-year reign. The cheers that would have followed this act of regicide, though perhaps not laughter, would have been a profound expression of relief from a city that had endured his peculiar brand of imperial madness for too long. You can almost feel the chilling finality of the moment, the swift, brutal swing of power that brought an end to the laughter ban and the emperor who conceived it. With Elagabalus's violent death, Rome swiftly moved to cleanse itself of his memory through a process known as damnatio memoriae. You see, this wasn't just about killing an emperor. It was about erasing his very existence from history, as if his bizarre reign had never happened. It was a powerful tool in Roman politics, a posthumous punishment designed to remove all traces of a disgraced individual. Imagine walking through Rome just after his death. The statues of Elagabalus, which had once been prominently displayed, would be swiftly pulled down and smashed. His name, carved into monuments and public inscriptions, would be chiseled away, leaving jagged, empty spaces. Coins bearing his likeness would be melted down or defaced. Any decrees or laws passed during his short, tumultuous reign that weren't immediately useful would be formally annulled. His images in private homes, if any brave soul still had them, would likely disappear, tucked away or destroyed for fear of association. It was a cultural act of purification, a collective sigh of relief manifested in the destruction of every physical reminder of the uncomfortable past.
Think of it as the ancient Roman equivalent of digitally scrubbing someone from all online records and photographs, only far more visceral and permanent. This ritualistic erasure served multiple purposes. Firstly, it allowed the new regime, led by the much more traditional Severus Alexander and his grandmother Julia Maesa, to immediately distance themselves from the scandalous and unpopular rule of Elagabalus. By formally condemning his memory, they validated the actions of the Praetorian Guard and signaled a return to traditional Roman values and stability. Secondly, it was a profound psychological act for the Roman populace. It was a way for them to collectively move on, to symbolically wipe the slate clean and forget the embarrassment and chaos that Elagabalus had brought. It provided a clear break, a definitive end to the period of forced solemnity and bizarre imperial antics. While damnatio memoriae was a common practice for unpopular emperors, its application to Elagabalus was particularly thorough, reflecting the extreme contempt he had garnered. Despite the efforts to erase him, his story, ironically, survived through the very historians who wrote about him, fascinated by his sheer peculiarity. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of damnatio memoriae in truly erasing an individual from collective memory, pondering whether such extreme measures only serve to highlight the very person they aim to obliterate. But for a time, Rome breathed a collective sigh of relief, eager to forget the emperor who tried to silence their smiles and hoped that his kind would never darken their doorstep again. You can almost feel the fresh air of a new, less peculiar era beginning to blow through the ancient streets.
With Elagabalus effectively erased from official memory, you witness Rome's return to normalcy under the new emperor, Severus Alexander. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Where Elagabalus reveled in chaos and disruption, Alexander, guided by his astute grandmother Julia Maesa, prioritized stability, tradition, and a respectful relationship with the Senate. It was a conscious effort to undo the damage of the previous 4 years and restore the Roman way of life. Imagine the subtle but profound changes. The grand temple to Elagabal on the Palatine Hill, once the center of bizarre rituals, would have been rededicated or repurposed. The sacred black stone, once paraded with such pomp, would have been quietly sent back to Emesa, its brief, unsettling journey to Rome over. The traditional Roman gods, Jupiter, Mars, Minerva, would have been restored to their rightful prominence, their temples once again bustling with familiar rites and ceremonies. This wasn't just a religious shift. It was a psychological reassurance to the Roman populace that order had been reestablished, that the gods were once again looking favorably upon their city. The social atmosphere, too, would have lightened considerably. The oppressive silence born from the laughter ban would have lifted, replaced by the natural sounds of a bustling city. The casual banter of merchants, the spirited debates in the forum, the uninhibited laughter of children playing in the streets. These sounds would have slowly but surely returned, like a gentle tide washing over a beach. People would no longer feel the constant need to monitor their expressions, to stifle their natural reactions. The spontaneity that enriches human interaction would bloom once more, fostering a sense of community and ease. It was like stepping out of a dark, stuffy room into the refreshing light of a new day. Severus Alexander himself contributed significantly to this return to normalcy. He presented himself as a learned, moderate, and pious ruler, always appearing in traditional Roman attire and consulting with the Senate. He reversed many of Elagabalus's more egregious appointments, replacing the emperor's favorite charioteers and dancers with experienced administrators. He focused on responsible governance, public works, and military discipline, all in stark contrast to his predecessor's capricious indulgences. Historians still argue whether Alexander was truly as virtuous as he was portrayed, or if his image was carefully manufactured by Julia Maesa to provide the ultimate counterpoint to Elagabalus. Nevertheless, the return to traditional Roman values and the lifting of the peculiar bans, including the one on laughter, would have been deeply welcomed by a populace weary of imperial madness. You can almost feel the collective exhale of relief as Rome finally found its footing again, a quiet, reassuring hum replacing the unsettling silence.
Even with Damnatio Memoriae and Rome's swift return to tradition, Elagabalus's enduring legacy remains, etched not in stone, but in the annals of history as arguably Rome's most eccentric and scandalous emperor. While many emperors came and went, often fading into obscure footnotes, Elagabalus persists in historical memory precisely because of his outlandish behavior. And the laughter ban is a prime example of that enduring oddity. He serves as a fascinating case study of what happens when absolute power falls into the hands of a young, impulsive individual completely detached from the cultural norms they are meant to uphold. He wasn't a great general, nor a skilled administrator. His impact wasn't felt through military conquests or grand public works. Instead, his legacy is one of profound social and religious transgression. He challenged gender roles, mocked ancient traditions, and attempted to reshape the very spiritual landscape of Rome according to his own peculiar vision. This makes him incredibly compelling to historians and storytellers, offering a vivid, if bizarre, window into the extremes of imperial caprice. He's often categorized alongside other mad emperors like Caligula or Nero, though his brand of madness was arguably more about profound social awkwardness and uninhibited self-expression than outright cruelty. His story serves as a peculiar historical benchmark. When you hear about an emperor doing something truly outlandish, Elagabalus often comes to mind. The tale of the laughter ban in particular is captivating because it touches upon such a fundamental aspect of human existence. It prompts us to reflect on the importance of freedom of expression, even in its most seemingly trivial forms, and highlights how deeply ingrained laughter is in our social fabric. It's almost ironic that an emperor who tried so hard to be forgotten, whose memory was officially damned, is remembered so vividly for his very efforts to control and upset the status quo. Historians still argue about the nuances of his reign, debating whether his actions were purely impulsive or had deeper, even if misguided, philosophical or religious underpinnings. But what's undeniable is that his brief time on the throne left an indelible, if often incredulous, mark on Roman history, ensuring he would never truly be erased. You can almost hear the quiet, astonished chuckle of history itself looking back at this most peculiar emperor.
As our long, gentle journey through the peculiar reign of Elagabalus finally draws to a close, you're left to ponder the ultimate lessons from a laughter ban. This strange episode in Roman history, where an emperor attempted to silence public joy, offers surprisingly profound insights into the nature of power, control, and the indomitable human spirit. Firstly, it's a vivid illustration of the dangers of unchecked, absolute power, especially when wielded by someone unprepared for its immense responsibilities. Elagabalus, a mere teenager, was thrust into an unparalleled position of authority, with no guiding hand, no understanding of the traditions he was meant to uphold, and no one truly capable of reining in his impulses. His reign serves as a cautionary tale. Power without wisdom or accountability can lead to profound absurdity, even when the intentions behind it are perhaps merely misguided rather than overtly malicious. It truly highlights how vital a stable and traditional governance system is for stability, whether ancient or modern. Secondly, the story underscores the inherent resilience of human expression. Laughter, as we have explored, is far more than just a sound. It's a social glue, a stress reliever, and a fundamental act of connection. Elagabalus could ban its public display, creating an atmosphere of suppressed mirth, but he could never truly extinguish the human need for it. The quiet giggles in private homes, the whispered jokes among trusted friends, the silent, shaking laughter, these acts of defiance show that certain human impulses are simply too deeply ingrained, too vital to our well-being to be fully controlled by external decree. It's a testament to our innate ability to find joy, even in the most restrictive or bizarre circumstances. Finally, Elagabalus's peculiar legacy makes you appreciate the simple freedoms we often take for granted. The freedom to express joy, to laugh openly with friends and strangers, to engage in light-hearted banter without fear of reprisal. These are not insignificant luxuries. They are crucial components of a healthy, vibrant society. His story, in its unique strangeness, reminds us to value these everyday liberties and to be wary of any attempts, however subtle or well-intentioned, to control our emotions or dictate our forms of expression. Historians still argue about whether such extreme attempts at emotional regulation were common in ancient times, or if Elagabalus was truly a unique outlier. But his reign stands as a stark reminder of what can happen when a leader tries to silence the very sound of happiness. As the echoes of ancient Rome fade and the peculiar tale of Elagabalus recedes into the soft mists of time, feel the gentle calm settle around you. The city, once tense with stifled smiles, now rests peacefully, its laughter restored, its ancient stones holding stories of both solemnity and mirth. Let the soft sounds of your own breathing guide you, slow and steady, like the quiet flow of the Tiber under a moonlit sky. The anxieties of the day, much like the strange decrees of a long-forgotten emperor, are fading away, growing distant and unimportant. Your mind, now quiet and still, is ready to embrace the deepest, most peaceful sleep. Just breathe in and let go. All is well.